welcome back to my channel. If you don't know me, my name is Jean, and hopefully this time next year I'll be Dr. Jean. Yes, not a medical doctor, but a academic PhD doctor. I am currently in the process of studying for my PhD, researching and writing up for my PhD, and have been for the past 5 years. If you've been following me over the past 5 years, you will have heard me mention this. This is not news to you, but something I haven't done in the past 5 years is go in detail and in depth with what exactly my PhD is on. I've talked about themes and overarching topics and also my general area of study, but I think one of the reasons that I haven't gone really in depth with my PhD over the past 5 years is because of the nature of a PhD, a humanities PhD, and my approach to my PhD. So when I sat down for my interview at the university I'm currently researching my PhD at, which is Roehampton, with my future supervisors and some other staff at the university, one of the things I was very adamant about was that I didn't have any pre-drawn conclusions. I didn't have a hypothesis I was going into my PhD to prove. Do you mind, seagull? Just the academic criticism from these birds. Sorry, so what was I saying? I didn't have any hypothesis I was going into my PhD to prove, and it will vary depending on what subject you study and what you're researching, but this is something that was very much true of my PhD, because what I wanted to do when I went into my PhD was look at a selection of evidence, was to look at specific texts and examine them for what they told us about an area of ancient history and ancient Athenian life that I felt was under-researched, if that makes sense. So my undergraduate and masters had led me to this point where I felt there was an area that deserved more research, that deserved more in-depth study, that deserved more discussion in the academic world. It's not to say nobody had looked at anything related to it, but it was to say that it had been underrepresented in the scholarship I had come across, and that there were questions I had constantly had throughout my own undergraduate and master's studies that had gone unanswered in the scholarship that currently existed. And through my reading of texts as I'd studied and grown as a scholar, I had encountered these sources and these texts. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I'd encountered these sources that I felt like said something about Athenian society. I wasn't exactly sure what it was, but I wanted to look at them more in depth. I can't remember exactly what I said in my interview now. It was like 6 years ago, but that's the general gist of it. And for that reason, like I said, I didn't know what I was aiming to prove. I didn't know what my final conclusions would be, but I'm at the point in my PhD now where I do know all of that. I have done all the research, I have done all the studying, I brought all the evidence together, and all I'm doing now is writing it all up in what I hope is a coherent, logically argued piece of rhetoric, effectively, that I am going to be submitting in less than 6 months' time for review by a panel and an interview, and hopefully, like I said, by this time next year I will have my doctorate. So I thought I would go into more depth about what exactly my PhD is about, because that is one of the most asked questions I have probably had for the past 5 years on this channel. So if you've managed to bear with me through that introduction, what exactly am I studying? If you don't know anything about me at all, then you might not even know that my speciality and my research subject is ancient Greece. I'm an ancient historian. I specialise in the ancient Greeks, although I do have a general interest in most ancient history. I find it all very, very interesting, but my specialist subject is ancient Greece, and specifically classical Athens. So classical Athens is a period of centuries which has been determined by modern scholars. It's not a term that the Athenians used themselves, but it indicates the period of Athenian history in which this sort of democracy was at its height, in which democracy was founded and rose to sort of what it would become and what we think of as ancient Athenian democracy. It covers a few different centuries, but specifically my research hones in on the 4th century, so the 300s BC. That is my time period, which is still in itself quite a large time period. We have a lot going on from the beginning of the 4th century to the end of the 4th century. As you know, 100 years is a long period. But what I'm specifically interested in during this period is the court speeches from ancient Athens. So I first encountered court speeches, Athenian court speeches, in my final year of my undergraduate, really in depth. I'd maybe come across one here or there in my studies for my undergraduate, which at Edinburgh university was 4 years, but I never in-depth studied Athenian law or Athenian rhetoric in the same way that I did in my 4th year, and I fell deeply in love. I found this subject so fascinating. I found these court speeches such a fascinating insight into Athenian society, into Athenian ideology, into Athenian politics and everyday life, because the sort of laws and the court cases that come up and the arguments and the rhetoric that are used in these court speeches, although of course as biased as any other sources, give us such an interesting indication and such interesting evidence towards what that period of time was like for ordinary Athenians. And I feel like it very much hones in on my interest in social history and ordinary people. But one of the things I felt particularly drawn to and particularly passionate about as I read more and more from this period and from these sources, these rhetorical orations, was the lives of Athenian women and also attitudes towards sexual violence. Because sexual violence is something that we see referenced in a lot of ancient Greek literature and a lot of great ancient Greek art. It's something that is so prevalent in their mythology, in their plays, in their political writings, but it's something that as a whole doesn't necessarily get focused on because we don't have, say, one court speech from a trial of sexual assault. We don't have a rape trial speech surviving, nothing like that, but we have it come up referenced time and time again as something that has almost become representative of Athenian values, or at least that's what I believe. And I decided to spend my masters in particular focusing in on women's lives and women's significance to the state, female citizens' significance to the makeup of the citizen body of the state in democratic Athens. And although citizen women can't go to court and speak on their own behalf, they rely on men to do that for them. They can't participate in the democracy in the same way that men can in Athens. I still wanted to better understand the intricacies of their role in society and where they did have power, for example in the religious sphere of life. So I looked more at that during my masters, and during that process, like I said, I became more and more in contact with these references to sexual violence, which were mere fleeting references. They were not, like I said, entire court speeches dedicated to the subject, but they were references that cropped up time and time again. And that was when I started to go down the route that has led me to my PhD. And as I haven't told you already, the title of my PhD research is The Politicization of Sexual Assault in 4th Century Athenian Rhetoric. So what I ended up doing, and I felt like I needed to have that preamble and that precursor to this discussion to sort of explain to you how I got here, is that I have spent the past 5 years specifically looking at both forensic speeches from the courts themselves during this period, but also speeches that would have had a much wider audience, like funeral orations, because the Athenian state hosted public funerals for those who died during war times that was funded by the state, and then they also employed somebody to give this speech, which sort of was meant to sort of foster connectivity and like make and reassure those that had lost sons or fathers or brothers during this war. Over time, as I honed in on a more specific research topic, what I ended up looking at were a selection of case studies that I found, which are references to sexual assault in Athenian oratory, so court speeches or funeral orations, that are specifically mythological. So take, for example, one of the case studies of my PhD, which is the funeral oration by Demosthenes, which was presented to the masses post-war in order to comfort them. And in his speech, he mentions the myth of Procne and Philomela, who were two sisters, and in their myth they are specifically Athenian princesses. So in Demosthenes' speech they are famed as the ancestors of those who have just gone and fought and died during this war. And in the myth, Procne is married off to the king of Thrace, Tereus, and misses her sister desperately, so asks Tereus to go and fetch her sister Philomela from her home in Athens, from her father the king, and bring her to their court in order for them to be together. But during the journey from Athens to Thrace, Tereus rapes Procne, and then even goes so far as to cut out her tongue to prevent her from sharing what has happened on their journey with her sister. But if you're familiar with the myth, you might know that Philomela ends up weaving a tapestry which explains the story of what happened to her, and Philomela and Procne end up taking revenge on Tereus for the sexual assault. That is the most basic synopsis I can give you of that myth. If you would like a really in-depth look at that myth, I actually have a podcast episode all about it, and I will link that down below. But that myth appears in Demosthenes' funeral oration. In his funeral oration, he says to the audience in front of him to remember the bravery of these two women in the face of sexual violence, and to think to themselves that those that have died in this most recent war have acted in a similar way, have upheld that sense of bravery and justice, which was something that fascinated me. This was really the case study that did it for me. This was the case study that I felt like, wow, what is going on here? I need to understand if this is representative of something much wider in Athenian rhetoric of this era. So I did a lot more looking and a lot more reading, and I ended up coming up with 3 more case studies, 3 more speeches from this period where Athenian orators reference myths of sexual assault in the context of the political arguments that they are making, and that is what my PhD ended up becoming. It is 3 chapters, each of which looks at a different myth, because 2 of the speeches that I'm looking at deal with the same myth. So we have a chapter, oh hi, oh sorry, oh I don't know if you can see, but I've got a little visitor here. Say hi, you want to say hi? Somebody's looking at the birds very hungrily, leave them alone, okay? Don't be mean to the birds, they're just living their life, okay? What was I saying? So basically, 2 of the speeches that I'm looking at deal with the same myth. So I have 3 main case studies, 3 main chapters to my PhD thesis, one of which looks at the use of the myth of Procne and Philomela, one of which looks at the myth of the sexual assault of Alcippe, who's the daughter of the god Ares, and the final of which looks at the myth of Helen's abduction by Paris, which, although in some sources is framed as consensual, is specifically framed in the oratory as an abduction against her will. So I have effectively honed in on these case studies throughout my PhD, of course looking at complementary, supplementary, contradictory evidence, although I wouldn't say there's a terrible amount of that, in order to establish what these case studies tell us about political attitudes to sexual violence in 4th century Athens. And what I really feel I have learned from my PhD is that, aside from the fact that we know sexual assault was illegal, although it didn't count as sexual assault, for example, if it was a slave, so that's like a whole other issue there, is that sexual assault is actually used as a rhetorical tool by political figures during this period. They use it as part of their rhetorical toolkit in order to make their arguments stronger, more virile towards their audiences, to convince those listening to them of what they are trying to say. And there are references within these speeches to non-mythological sexual violence, and I definitely discuss those in my PhD, but I'm honing in on these mythological ones because what myths often become in rhetoric is examples of contemporary ideology. Myths are used to prove who Athenians are, to define what is Athenian, to establish Athenian sort of lineage and the grandness in which they descend from, and complement the contemporary Athenian political society, so complement the democracy, which was something that a lot of these orators and citizens were very, very proud of during this period. And it becomes almost a symbol of who Athenians are, and in that way becomes less and less about women themselves and becomes far more about the society that protects women, defends women, or punishes those that would harm women. I use these sort of quotation marks only because this does not apply to all women. Like I've mentioned, you have to be a woman of a certain status, and that is something that is very prevalent throughout any discussion of women in classical Athens, and my PhD included. Citizenship status is almost a prerequisite to being considered a woman that can be sexually assaulted. It's also something that the Athenians then use to set themselves apart from other societies. So in contexts in which they're discussing battles or wars, they can frame themselves as defenders of women, as upholders of women's rights, as protectors of women, whereas their enemies are those that would assault women. And this is how it becomes a political ideology and a political tool. And this does not mean it's reflective of society, because this is something I look at in my thesis. Just because a society frames itself as a protector of women and instead uses sexual violence as a way to other does not mean that either of those things are true. And throughout my PhD, I make comparative studies of other cultures and societies who have used sexual assault as an othering technique in their rhetoric, and it's something that you still see today. It's something that you see in contemporary politics, where figures like Trump stand up and accuse refugees of being rapists, and that's why you need to keep them out of your country. Or when in the antebellum South, the threat of sexual violence is used as an excuse to commit lynchings. So what I think we actually have in these ancient Athenian texts is one of the earliest examples of sexual violence being used as a rhetorical tool to other and to self-identify, to define a culture, and to separate oneself from another group and to create this national identity. And that in itself is incredibly fascinating. My thesis ended up becoming much more about broader political ideology and rhetorical tools than it did about necessarily the everyday lives of ancient Athenian women, but at the same time to look at the way in which women are used and that sexual violence against women is used in a political and rhetorical context can still teach us a lot about attitudes towards women and the way women are treated and to women's lives in a society. You just have to look a little bit deeper beneath the surface, and that is something I try to do through my PhD. Obviously I've not submitted it yet, and I still feel like there are nuances that I am finding ways to articulate in my writing up process, which is what I'm doing just now. But that is the overarching theme. That is what my PhD is all about, and it feels so strange to sort of summarise it here. And it's also difficult to know whether I've given you enough context, because I also appreciate that this is very much just like a verbal rundown of what my PhD thesis is about without all of the evidence in front of you, without all of the research and without all of the background that typically people would have if they were reading a PhD thesis, although I hope it's generally made some sort of sense for you and has maybe like sparked a little bit of interest in this topic. I do hope that if all goes according to plan, I will eventually publish my PhD thesis, although that won't probably be for a couple of years at least. And in the meantime, I do have a chapter in an academic volume called Rape in Antiquity Volume 2. So this is a follow-on volume to Rape in Antiquity Volume 1, which came out in the 90s, and I'm actually one of the editors on, so I'm an editor along with two other scholars who have been pulling together contemporary scholarship on issues surrounding sexual violence in both ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and also in reception studies. So that will hopefully be out in 2022. I'll definitely be able to give you a clearer publication date on that closer to the time. It's being published by Bloomsbury's academic division, and my chapter is specifically on the topic of Procne and Philomela, not my entire thesis, because it's a chapter in a book and not an entire 100,000 word thesis, which is what my project will end up being once I've completed it. Way back, right at the beginning, in the first year of my PhD, I did publish a short online article with the Dangerous Women's Project that I'll link down below. It's much shorter and was at a much earlier stage in my PhD, but it might still be interesting for you to read. I also do run an ancient history podcast. If that's something you're not familiar with, it will be linked in the description box down below. So there are episodes on Helen and Procne and Philomela, which obviously pertain to my thesis, but also many more episodes and many other guests besides myself. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. It's kind of difficult to know, although people have been asking about what my PhD is on, what exactly to tell you and how to explain it, particularly given that I haven't submitted it and been up against my Viva panel yet and had my corrections. So this is sort of where my PhD is at just now. This is hopefully an explanation that is accessible to those that don't necessarily have classics degrees and is interesting to those that don't necessarily have classics degrees, but something I'm very passionate about. It's something that I care a lot about, and although I am very much ready to be done with this chapter in my life, I am very much ready to move on from the PhD research phase of my career. I am so proud of what I have done and so glad that I did do it, and I'm excited to submit. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. I have no idea how long I've been filming, and I'm really concerned about how long this video is going to be, but you asked. The final thing is going to be 100,000 words, so count yourself lucky for how short this video is, even if it's an hour long. I also have an entire children's book dedicated to Greek mythology if you just want somewhere to start and read about ancient Greek myths, that I'll link in the description box down below, which is published by DK, as well as some videos that I've done in the past just generally about PhD and ancient history. I will just link anything that I feel you might be interested interested in down below to learn more about this area and my experiences. So yeah, that pretty much covers it. But until next time, thanks for watching, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!